Um, I want to welcome everybody. I am Dana Mortensen. I'm the co-founder and CEO of World Savvy. We will be coming up on our 20th year this in 2022. And World Savvy's work is we are a national education nonprofit that works to embed global competence into K-12 education for systems change. So we're looking at how we can prepare the next generation of young people to really thrive in a more diverse and interconnected world. The way that we do that, and Denny, maybe you want to pull up a slide because the visual often helps, is that we provide wraparound supports in K-12 whole school partnerships. We work with school leaders, we work with educators, not just about what to teach, but how to teach this way. And we work directly with students to provide project-based learning and design thinking that helps them become change makers. So the connection to solutions-oriented thinking and change making is really strong. I think we need to change the slide. We've been doing this for about 20 years, and I met David years ago through Ashoka. I'm a fellow, which also centers around a change maker mindset. And what I find really magical about his work, and I'm super excited to talk about it tonight, is that we think very similarly, that the world is filled with individuals with incredible solutionary capacity. I borrowed that phrase from Zoe Wild is on here from the Institute for Humane Education, but that every young person can be a change maker, and that K-12 education is a place, really fertile ground to build those foundational skill sets and the mindset for it. So our organization helps to systemically and holistically help schools and districts across the country do that. Just a little bit of a glimpse of where we're headed, where we've been and where we're headed, if you want to change the slide, Denny. To date, and again, we've been doing this work since 2002. Just going to wait for a slide change. We've got a good fade in effect. We've reached more than 800,000 students and almost 7,000 teachers across 45 US states and 32 countries. Our goal by 2035 is to engage a network of 10,000 K-12 schools, which is about 10% of middle schools and high schools in the US, across diverse geographies, including rural communities, reaching about 5 million students. Our goal is to really change the discourse and the conversation about what constitutes a quality education, so that's centered around building the competencies that make for engaged citizenship and building a better world. So the connection to David's work should be obvious, but I'm going to share it because it's something that really inspires me. I've been a big fan of David's work for quite some time. So with us tonight is David Bornstein. He's a journalist and an author who specializes in writing not only about social innovation, but about solutions journalism. And so he's a New York Times columnist in the Fixes column, where this is another place we connected because he wrote about World Savvy, and they explore and analyze potential solutions to major problems. But he is also the co-founder of Solutions Journalism Network, which is a building, growing, vast network that supports journalists who report on constructive responses to social problems. David's also an author. His first book came out in 2005, which was the story of the Grameen Bank, called The Price of a Dream, tracking the Green Bank's first 20 years and what became the now famous microfinance field. And he also was the author of How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas, which was a sort of anchor of a lot of Ashoka's work in reframing everyone a change maker and a change maker world. So absolutely thrilled to have you with us here tonight, David. And we're going to kick off by getting a little bit of insights from a PBS clip where David has some of the most quote-worthy pieces around why this work is so important, to set some context for everybody that's with us here tonight. So with that, Denny, I'll ask you to cue up that video.
I mean, I like to think about news just as a feedback system. You know, a good feedback system to work needs to let you know what you need to be afraid of, what you need to be aware of, and you need to know what you can do about it. You need to know where the efficacy is. If you only do one without the other, you're going to cause people to bury their heads in the sand. And if you only do the other thing, then you're a sort of a Pollyanna, and you're making people feel good, but you're not really giving them information that's true to reality. But in balance, you can activate people. And I think journalism at its best should activate people to be powerful players in a participatory democracy. There's just a great sense of well-being that comes from that way of living. And I think that journalism or any media should help build that capacity, should help feed it. it doesn't take away from, letting us know about wars and corruption and malfeasance and what we're seeing, obviously in politics around the world with populism. But at the same time, if we make that the only focus of our attention, we will be leaving the best of human nature on the table, basically. The main way that the news harms democracy is by providing a view of the world that is largely deficit framed. I mean, we are amply informed about what's going wrong, about what's ugly, about what's corrupt. But because we don't have a similar amount of information about what's growing, what are the new possibilities emerging, we have a very flawed kind of one-sided view. It's as if your parents were only ever criticizing what you did and never letting you know where you had possibilities to grow. Many people who I think would love to participate in contributing to a better community, even a better society or world, have an impoverished sense of their power to do so. Particularly when it comes to communities that have experienced poverty historically, or communities of color in the United States especially, you have narratives that have been deficit framed for as long as we've had journalism. You could look at major news organizations across the United States. You look at the Metro Daily, the large newspaper in that community, and you take a community of color and you type in the search, and you'll find in many cases that the majority of stories are about violence, as if to say that is the majority of activity in that community. Now, I'm not denying that we should cover violence. The point is, it's not the only truth. We should tell the whole story. And if we don't tell the whole story about communities, we are creating bias in the minds of people who often have power over those communities. What we're seeing, what I see, just because I'm a sort of the spider at the center of this web of solutions journalism, is my head is filled with stories of solutions all the time, which really inoculates you against some of the bad stuff that's been coming our way in recent years. Catch the world doing the right thing and let that also spread. My name is David Bornstein, and this is my brief but spectacular take on telling the whole story.
So welcome back, everybody. David, I wanted to just jump in with a couple of questions just around what motivated a shift for you to examine journalism through this lens. You've been a journalist for a while, and this is obviously a deeply held passion, and it's quite different than what we're used to seeing in the news. So where did that motivation come from?
Yeah, and thank you for having me here. Well, as you mentioned, I wrote about the Grameen Bank in the 90s, and then Ashoka 10 years later, and I just saw that the world, there were these extraordinary stories all around the world. I mean, I saw them firsthand, and they just weren't getting out. And one thing happened to me. My father, after my mother passed away, she had Alzheimer's. My father kind of got depressed, and I live in New York. He used to live in Montreal, and I would call him late at night and just kind of check in on him. And one day he answered the phone, and his voice was so heavy. He was just like, Dave, I think the world is just, human beings are worse than animals. And he was just he had such pain and fatigue in his voice. And I was just like, Dad, are you watching CNN again? and he was, that's what he would do. He would fall asleep to the news every night. And I got off the phone, I was just really angry. Like, after all the pain and suffering that individuals have to go through just with the normal challenges of life, and then having to consume this sort of toxic signal that gives an extraordinarily distorted and harmful idea. Once again, we don't want to be Pollyannish. We don't want to not know about the threats, but there's so much happening and so much more available. And it really occurred to me that journalism dramatically needed to shift the signal and tell a much broader kind of truth, much more comprehensive kind of truth. And as someone who had chronicled the field of social entrepreneurship, I know that there are 1,000 or 10,000 more social entrepreneurs in the world, or change makers, than there are terrorists or people causing violence. It's not even close. And yet, what occupies our attention every day and what gets amplified, especially through social media now every day, is pretty much the worst thing that happens every day. And, so it was very personal at that moment.
We actually, I had a meeting with a colleague today where a donor asked how optimistic was that, really like sort of where your dad was struggling with the depth, particularly in the last couple of years. It's very real. So when our audience is thinking about what is solutions journalism and what is solutions journalism network, how would we know that when we see it? What are the elements of it? And if we could really make this shift, what would the impact be, do you think?
Yeah, so the simplest definition of solutions journalism is just rigorous reporting that looks at how people are responding to problems and what we can learn from it. And you can draw that out. There's many other things that go into it, but that's it. It's really just looking at the adaptive resilience that is part of the way people try to solve problems. Our network, we're a nonprofit. We have a staff of about 50 now, and we do a mindset shift with journalists around the world. So we've worked with now more than 25,000 journalists and over 550 news organizations, and that's Africa, Western and Eastern Europe, the United States, Latin America. And our original mission was to legitimize and spread the practice of solutions journalism. We have now parked that mission and created a new one because that's actually happened more quickly than we expected. And now our mission is to transform journalism for an equitable and sustainable world. And so it's much more of working through the network and the platform that has been built to really try to go a lot faster, essentially.
That is incredible growth. I remember when this was just beginning, and that's optimism to me, that people want to see that shift happen, and that you've had so much success on so many different continents. The last couple of years, we've talked about this offline quite a bit, but it seems like we've been waging this war on facts and science and intellectualism in general here in the US, but more broadly as well, and ushered in this new kind of intense skepticism of not only journalism and media, but also knowledge in general and how we find it and we access it. And it's my belief, we've talked about this, that's accelerated some of the polarization, particularly when it's coupled with online platforms of communication. So as a really seasoned journalist, what do you make of this shift? And how might what you're doing be an approach that helps to mitigate that momentum?
Yeah, I mean, really what you're talking about is the way people, how and why people trust the sources of information they get. And the journalists, I'm a journalist. Many of my friends are journalists, and they basically say you should trust me because my facts are correct. And they think that that's just kind of enough. But that's not really how trust works. Trust is a function of a quality of a relationship. You can say it, I don't care what you know until I know that you care, right? Do you have my back? If you have my back, I'll trust you. People actually, and that's worked a lot longer than journalism has existed. So why don't people trust journalists? Because it's not really clear that journalists have people's backs. I mean, if your news source is telling you every day, if your news source is slandering your community and only describing the awful things that happen in your community, never capturing the agency or the capacity of the people you care about and love, that's one way to not trust it. If your news source is not providing you information that really helps you understand what your credible options are to deal with climate change or racism or immigration, whatever the issue is, if it's just providing information that freaks you out and makes you anxious and sends you running to the bar to have a drink or whatever, that's not the basis of trust. Even if the story is accurate, you're not going to do that. So getting journalism to be genuinely helpful in people's lives, to be a feedback system that really helps people understand what they need to be aware of, what's dangerous in their midst, whether it's local or at the global level. And then, of course, feeding that sense of efficacy, that sense of control. A lot of research on misinformation suggests that the desire for misinformation comes from feeling out of control, that people seek information, even if it seems crazy, even conspiracy theories, because it helps people make sense of things that they're having trouble making sense of. They feel so, and journalism actually has created a lot of the anxiety that misinformation exploits. So these are, problems that have to be solved together.
Yeah, and add to that a global pandemic, and the grappling with racial inequity and all the things that have happened in the last couple of years, and it seems like that has accelerated.
Yeah.
We had a conversation around, there's lots of groups of people in the absence of that trust, and I believe change moves at the speed of trust, that talk about doing their own research, sort of absent anything that's been offered by the mainstream. And so I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, to say, what does it look like to engender trust as an institution delivering information? And I think you're right. If the spotlight on the community or the people you care about is always negative, that would be hard to do.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
here's a really simple analogy just to add to that. Imagine going to a doctor and the doctor spending, it's a half an hour appointment, and the doctor spends 29 minutes telling you how sick you are. And at the end of the appointment says, there may be some treatment options. See you later. And then that's pretty much news, right?
right.
Creates a lot of anxiety. Now there always are treatment options. It's not like, and sometimes some problems are really hard to deal with. I'm not minimizing the challenges, but generally speaking, most problems have some kinds of response mechanisms that are available, whether the evidence is good or not. The fact that that's such a small portion of the signal that people get every day creates the kind of frustration and anxiety you'd have walking out of your doctor's appointment that day, not knowing what you can do about something you're scared of.
Of course. I also love you. You just said it earlier, but it's also in the PBS video, which again, I strongly encourage everyone to circle back to, because every time I talk to David, I have a subsequent conversation in my head after, to process what we've talked about. But you talked about, from the very first time I heard you speak, you talked about this idea that for every terrorist, there's 1,000 change makers. There's 1,000 people trying to do something positive to change. Or I've heard you frame it, you say it in the video, of catch people doing something right more often. I feel like there's been almost a cultural trend where optimism seems naive and like a luxury or a privilege, that we can't afford ourselves in these last couple of years. And so I'm really curious, as your work has exploded in the last few years, as the world seems to be grappling with so many challenges. What are some of those stories, the solutions based stories, that bring you that kind of hope and optimism, that have really sort of, leave you thinking like, the arc of this is going to be okay?
Well, we don't know that. There's a distinction between hope and optimism that I would make if we really got into semantics.
Yeah.
But there are, if you look at what we now understand about people, for example, and the role of trauma, for example, in adverse childhood experiences, just how deeply it shapes people and can affect their whole lives, certainly their education, their health choices, their relationship choices. There's just been such advances just in the last 20 years around how to help children who've had severe adversity growing up, the kinds of things that can very quickly derail. I mean, it can derail you in Head Start before you even get to kindergarten. So you're not even ready for your ABCs because you're so vigilant and you're so unable to really be present just to learn. But there are so many interesting modalities that are emerging now that are really helping kids, and helping parents help their children, and helping educators work with children in these contexts, and that are changing the way pediatric care works and so forth. This is, I think, a hinge moment. I think it's one of these profound insights, especially for communities where there's collective or generational trauma, and you see, sort of statistics that play out over and over and over again, large patterns in suffering and in difficulties, that are based on, historical inheritances. So I think that that's very positive and an important place. And you can Google ACEs in the solution story tracker, which I'll show afterwards. And you can see that there's lots and lots of stories of places doing much smarter things than even 10 years ago. I think that's a really big pattern. Another big pattern that I've seen, and I'll talk about, rather than individual stories would be larger patterns, is just, there are people putting things together much smarter now. It's kind of like, The idea that you go over here for your mental health care, you go here for your education, you go here for your housing, you go here for your, after school services, it just makes no sense. I mean, it's like these pin factories that are all specializing in doing one thing and causing people to make all sorts of trade-offs in their lives all the time that just don't make sense, which is why so many social services dramatically underperform what they could do. You're now beginning to see more places, like there's one organization called the Full Frame Institute that really helps systems integrate how do you deal with whole people rather than looking at just, I'm only dealing with, your after school portion of your life and the housing person is over there, when we really know if you want to help a kid with asthma be healthy, the school's got to be on it, the parents got to be in on it, the housing has to be in on it, you've got to have the medical establishment has to be in on it. You have to really be able to have these integrated solutions. And in some ways, this is sort of pushing against 200 years of capitalism that has really pushed people, Henry Ford sort of, assembly line kind of thinking, we'll just do one thing and we'll do it well. We now see integration as and whole. So those are two patterns that I think many, many, many stories fit into. I think they can really dramatically change sort of the performance capacity we see from efforts to help people.
We see this in our work in education, this idea of, whole child education didn't really exist when I got into the field. This idea of thinking about the fact that more than one thing impacts whether you can show up, be ready to engage. That could be hunger, that could be housing instability, that could be any one of a variety of things. And the trauma example is a really great one too, because that's not something that's now isolated as a topic for discussion, but is becoming much more of a systems kind of conversation.
So important, yeah. I love the organization Playworks, which you know about. Jill Violet is an Ashoka Fellow. She, understanding the role of play in the lives of elementary school children and how dramatically it impacts their ability to learn and just enjoy and just make friends. I mean, it's such a big thing. And yet for years, we had schools that were sort of banning recess and eliminating it because we had this idea that it was going to take time away from teaching to the test. I mean, truly insane stuff. So bringing that back in full force is so valuable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I want to apply that to the movement to rebrand soft skills because the things that are typically referenced as soft skills are all those things that make it possible to sort of be whole. So yeah, that's an excellent observation. It's not, I think a shift to systems oriented thinking has been particularly tested in this time when, as a country, we're reckoning with racial injustice and what that has looked like historically in the path forward. And I'm hopeful that more of that systems thinking can be applied to that and thinking about the integrated approach there. I'm curious because as you know, many on our call tonight may not know that several years ago we started working in rural communities, felt it was really important, felt that there was almost a palpable feeling of division and separation that had been growing over the last couple of decades, and that it wasn't really adding any benefit, right, to addressing problems that we as a diversifying multi-ethnic democracy were going to have to tackle together. I know that solutions journalism has done an unbelievable job in really reaching out quite broadly. I mean, you talked about the growth of this network. You said 500 news outlets. I mean, it's extraordinary. I also know that many of those have been partnerships in rural communities. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit about your observation around how journalism, in different kinds of communities, urban, rural, has how those shifts in journal solutions lens have happened and what you think the impact is, and maybe even why it's so important to do that in rural as well as urban.
Yeah, and the local level of that is so, it goes back to the trust issue ultimately and really how a democracy works. I mean, if you want to reconstitute trust, and you have to start doing it at the local level. I mean, it's very hard to get people watching a major national broadcast or a major national news organization to get a signal that really feels like I can trust this. At the local level, it's very easy. I mean, you may bump into the reporter in the coffee shop if we're talking about journalism, but at the same time, it's going to be very specific to you. I mean, you may have really big issues with an environmental issue. The flooding every year is getting worse. We had, 300-year floods in the last 10 years is something that many communities can now say. So if you have your local news organization that's saying, we're really actively working on what will help our community build more resilience to that, and what will help our farmers improve their soil productivity in the face of environmental changes, very specific things, people will start saying, well, I don't really like journalists that much, but this newspaper is pretty good. They've been doing good stuff for us. You kind of have this thing that starts growing from the ground up. And so I think, kind of like the soil of America in a way is an important place to be. And it's not the only place. These digital platforms are so profoundly powerful, but they amplify signals that come from the ground. And a local news organization can get its signal out and on Facebook to 1 million people just as well as the New York Times can. So it's really, and once again, it just goes back to it goes back to Michael Harrington, The Other America, and the notion that there is extraordinary inequality of access. With the decline of manufacturing and of agriculture in the United States, and the offshoring of so much, you have communities that really, people are sad. All the kids leave as soon as they can graduate, and people feel it's the work that's really matters to them and was really associated with dignity is not valued anymore. And this creates a lot of the hurt that translates ultimately into the politics we're seeing in the country. If we look at it not as anger or meanness, but if we look at it as hurt and fear, it's easier to understand.
I couldn't agree more. And in thinking a lot about the way reporting, at least our work in rural communities, has shown us too, that some communities we partner with are very used to being given ideas from the outside or told that a solution comes from outside the community, and an opportunity to have local news outlets showcase and think about solutions that are generated from the wisdom in the room, so to speak, for these rural communities themselves is really powerful. And I can see how that would certainly engender the kind of trust that you need. So the other piece I wanted to talk about in a very systems-oriented way, which is something we share, you're thinking ahead to train the next generation of solutions journalists, some of whom are with us tonight. And so I'm wondering, what are your hopes for the field at large as you look a decade or more out, or what would you tell your 15-year-old self? Because now you're really talking about not just sort of siloing this as solutions journalism, but transforming the whole field. So what do those efforts look like for sort of the future?
And by the way, I just want to thank you for the way you responded to that last question, because I did what journalists do all the time. I looked at the problem and forgot the assets and the capacity and the agency. That's in an all teach, all learn world, the agency in communities around the country cannot be overlooked. And so thank you for saying that.
And I think we're also, there's a lot of humility involved, and because to recognize the hubris when we think we're experts or we think we have solutions, particularly you and I work in the social entrepreneurship context where the obsession with scaling solutions and exporting them out at a pace that's impressive is often absent the context of the people, the humans who are impacted by how that solution lands in a particular way. And certainly our World Savvy's view is that without context, that's meaningless. It's one of the reasons why we don't say best practices, and instead we use effective principles, because it's a recognition that nothing can be picked up and dropped in somewhere if you are not of and from that place. So yeah, I appreciate the calling that out. But
yeah, totally. And the cross-pollination of those ideas becomes the thing to do. Make sure that the answer is in the room, but the room might be the country. It might not be your community. Someone has it.
Exactly. Yeah.
But my 15-year-old self, it's such a good question. I think I always think that one can find one's sort of deep purpose by thinking about kind of like who the me question, my talents, my abilities, my loves, the things that really, people don't come up with ideas when they're 18. They come up with them when they're 6 and they realize they've been doing this for 12 years. People have interests that are very natural and sort of ways of engaging that are distinct and make them happy, but also they tend to be quite good at it. Then there's this, what the world really needs, the social need, which is always, and you can look at it in many ways. There's human needs, there's environmental needs, there's social justice needs, there's so many. And then there are these kind of moments of opportunity when new things emerge and become possible. In my life, it was, wow, journalism is collapsing. It can change. You know, fields when they're in crisis are actually extremely open to new ideas, much more so than fields that are making money and we don't need to talk to you kind of thing. So if you kind of look at this, what is the moment? What is the opportunity? What's emerging? What's the need? And who am I? And you kind of draw 3 circles, Venn diagrams around that. You can find this might be places for me to plug in. And what's so valuable, and I think why your work is so important, is you need to understand what's the landscape looking like? What are people doing? What are ways that people are approaching this problem? I mean, what are new ways that people are thinking about being nurses, or new ways that people are thinking about being executives of firms that used to burn things that don't want to keep burning them anymore, and so forth. So in order to be creative, you have to have a palette with lots of colors to paint with. And so I would encourage the 15-year-old to go and look and really, really see what are the ideas that are emerging out there that will be the ones that could help me, connect with my desire to really make contributions. And it could be to my family, to my community. They don't come to you enough. Your work is fantastic. It's so distinctive. But in general, I think education is so focused on critical thinking that it doesn't do enough constructive thinking. It doesn't do enough about helping people see what are the ideas out there, what's possible. And you need to feed that. And so news is a good way to do it. We have all sorts of solution stories, which I can show you later on, that are one way to access that. And then there are these networks like Ashoka and many others that have lots of examples of people approaching problems with distinctive strategies and so forth. But Bill Drayton used to say that if you ask a good social entrepreneur, he always would say, a good social entrepreneur, what are the 5 most innovative ideas in the world in your field? They'll usually be able to answer that question, because they're always looking for what are things I could use, what are ideas out there I could use. And that, building that into education, building that into parenting, and building it into your own sort of apprenticeship as you grow up is a really great thing to do. So that we need feeds for that, because everything's coming through feeds. So TikTok feeds and what have you that carry that signal, in addition to how to be a great vegan chef or whatever it is.
That would actually be extraordinary, sort of the solutions journalism version of TikTok, where like mini ideas of, because that would be, when you go down the rabbit hole of getting stuck in a platform like that for 2 hours looking at, nonsensical things, it would be great to apply it in a different way. But I think about your comments
totally doable. Absolutely doable.
Yeah.
And not hard to do, actually.
Right. I mean, this idea of just absolutely immersed in, I love that. And I think, I was looking at some of the issues as people were joining, saying, what are the things you wish there was more reporting about? And you tying it back to this idea of like, what happens when people feel powerless, right? When they don't feel like they have control. And climate has always seemed like one of those issues, right? It feels so big. It feels so that an individual thinking about recycling or other things can feel really sort of dissuaded to stay in that movement. And so I love that idea of sort of making sure that those solutions are all around and we're immersed in them. And I feel like by osmosis, there's some hope in that too. So I love that. And you have a fellowship now, am I correct, at Solutions Journalism that's actually designed for aspiring journalists to come into the system. So almost like an upstream solution to get that training before they are ever even at a news outlet, right?
Yeah. And we're working with a lot of journalism schools there's more than 100, I think it's 130 now, that have created solutions journalism content or curriculum. And quite a number of them are actively, really engaged. Like we have, we work with a group of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, that have created an HBCU Educators Academy focused on solutions journalism. There's also an academy focused from Hispanic serving institutions as well. And many journalism schools are bringing this in. And in fact, the students and teachers will tell you reporting on problems is a privilege. Well, our community can't afford to only know about our problems. Our community needs ideas. Don't give us this privilege where you come in here and you just tell us how bad things are and then you go back home kind of thing. So local journalism, more journalists who really reflect and respect the communities they're covering is absolutely crucial to this. And so getting young kids going into journalism, they're going into a field that is in disarray. So these are people who are doing it for the right reasons. This is not like I'm going to be rich kind of thinking. This is I'm going to try to reconstitute a field and make it better thinking. And so we are helping them understand this framework, and they will repurpose it and change it dramatically, and it won't look anything like it does right now. But that's just the way it needs to go and ought to go.
Yeah, that's incredible. There's I don't know if they're on tonight, but a group of students here that formed an organization I mentioned to you called Changemakers that lobbied the Minnesota legislature to give unemployment benefits, 70 million in unemployment benefits to young people who were often the breadwinners in their homes. Some of these were kids experiencing homelessness who, their income was everything. So they've been motivated too by this kind of thinking to start in the field around shifting that lens. I think that's really incredible. The next question, and maybe final, and I'm going to let you show the platform and open it up for some questions, is a little bit more cynical, but everybody who's in the room with us tonight has certainly heard this adage that media produces and sells what people watch, as if to almost shift kind of the blame or create a circular discussion where the motivation is, well, we only produce this because that's what people want to see. Reality shows, fear-based kind of reporting, violence, despair. I mean, I guess I'd say, A, do you believe that's true? And B, what do you believe would drive increased demands for that kind of reporting? I mean, how do you shift that narrative to say, report in this way and you can change the discourse in the public?
I mean, we have seen in so many news organizations now that when they change the product, when they start producing more solutions journalism and letting their audience know about it, you have to signpost it as well and say, hey, do you notice this is a latte and not an instant coffee? This is a different thing we're giving you. How do you like it? People actually, these stories get better engagement. News organizations that do solutions journalism, and we've actually worked with news organizations and research organizations that have done A/B testing, where they compare solutions journalism directly apples to apple with the same issue being covered in a problem-only frame, and the solution stories are rated much, much higher. We did a big one with news stations, local TV news stations around the country, with an organization called Smith Geiger, which does these kinds of studies. So better engagement. We have a number of news organizations that have raised, millions in revenues by basically going to local foundations and communities and say, would you like more solutions journalism for our community around issues that are difficult in our communities? And they've been able to raise money from sponsorships, local foundations, and bring people in. So this is, I think, if you look, the Reuters Institute has a study on news avoidance that comes out. It's come out, I think it's annual, it might be biannual, but the main reasons people are avoiding news avoidance is on the rise. People are not following news as much as they have in the past, and it's on the rise globally, but it's high in the US, it's particularly high in some other countries as well, like Turkey, I think is very high as well. The number one reason is it depresses me. These are the top reasons. It makes me feel powerless and I don't know if I can trust it. Those are the reasons people are avoiding it. It's kind of like a restaurateur saying, why don't you eat here more often? And the customer's like, because your food doesn't taste good.
Right. It gives me food poisoning.
Gives me food poisoning. If the FDA, put a warning on journalism, which the CDC, by the way, did earlier last year, saying, don't watch too much news. It's not good for your mental health. So there's like this could be dangerous to consume kind of thing. So there's such a problem with the product. Now, it takes time to reconstitute trust, to rebuild audiences around a new product. I'm not saying outrage doesn't sell or the tweet of the day from someone doing something really outrageous. I'm not saying these things don't go viral. We are wired to pay attention to threats evolutionarily. We're wired to pay more attention to threats evolutionarily wise. That's just kind of like basic evolutionary psychology. We're also wired to pay attention to things that are genuinely helpful to us, things that create a sense of hopefulness or awe or respect or appreciative knowledge about other things. These things are very, very valuable too. So it's really, a question of news organizations doing this consistently, doing it well, telling people they're doing it, and asking the audiences to pay for it. And the audiences are responsible for the news they get, because it is true, if you're lazy in your feeds and you just kind of, you know, have the Twinkies only version of what you're clicking on, that's what you'll continue to get. That will send a signal. So that's, you know, who has the power. Now that it's unbundled and news has to stand on its own 2 feet, the audience has so much more power than it used to.
Right. Right. I want to, we're actually, I knew this would happen, but I have another couple of questions that I'm going to save because I want to give our audience a chance to ask. And maybe before we do that, if you've got questions for David or for us both, please put them in the chat. But David is going to, actually, we're going to give him the screen so he can share the actual platform that we're talking about. So David's built this phenomenal movement that I've watched grow over the last 5 years in incredible ways. And now I'd love, you know, if you are feeling depressed by the news, this network is for you. So let's let David share his screen and give us a quick demo.
Yeah, and I'll do this super fast. So I'm gonna figure out how to do this. 1 second. Okay. So can you all see this, the story tracker? Can you see that, Dana? Solutions.
Yeah, we can see not the story tracker yet. It's just the 12. Oh yeah, now we can. You're typed here to search stories. Yep. So
this is very quickly, this is called the Solution Story Tracker. If you go to our website, maybe you can put in the link. It's a database where we aggregate solutions journalism from around the world. So you can see that it currently has 12,500 and something stories. And so, you know, earlier people were putting in issues that they care about. So let's just say you are interested in climate change. And since this is World Savvy, let's say you're also interested in looking at solutions that are occurring outside the United States. So I'm just going to go climate change, and I'm going to click on outside the USA. It'll filter down from the 3,000 climate change stories. It'll filter down, or the 500, it'll filter down to 304 results. Each of these is a story published in an outlet that is now doing solutions journalism. That is one piece in the puzzle in this kind of global challenge that we all are dealing with. So, you know, each of these stories, you can read about them, you can go directly to the story. You know, in this case, this is an article from the Narwhal, which is in Columbia, British Columbia, Canada. You can click on the landing page for that story, which tells you about a little bit about it. It'll tell you, it's a long story. This one's 3,000 words, so only that one you might want to do. There's other stories at the bottom that are similar to this story, and then you can go directly to that story and go to the source. I hope they can pick it up. Well, I won't be able to sort of go right now into these stories. I'm going to do a very quick demo, but just to give you a sense of some of the kinds of questions that can be looked at is here's a topic called engaging in empathetic dialogue that has come up because of the polarization and because of how much the fault lines that are broken around the world, the high conflict that's leading to violence and extreme, or that is part of the extreme polarization. So if you want to sort of, if you're teaching about engaging in empathetic dialogue, or how do we actually have conversations across lines of difference, whether they're religious fault lines or political fault lines, you could click on that and you'll see that there's 200 stories that look at, you know, this. And I'll go again, since we're World Savvy, I'll go outside the US to filter it down. And you'll see that there's 55 stories about how people are sort of bridging differences. And so this one is, you know, this first story is how Otukpo became an oasis of peace in Benue after Fulani militia is attacked. So this is very specific. This is in Nigeria, where there's been a lot of violence and a peacekeeping process that's really cut that violence down to, I think, only one death in the last 3 or 4 years, which is quite remarkable. You know, here's a story about a clubhouse room. It's very moving, actually, that appeared in Slate, where people are, Palestinians and Israelis are actually talking about the pain and suffering that they have respectively gone through with moderators who must be non-Palestinian and non-Israeli in order to do this. And this is a place where this kind of conversation is happening online. It's actually a really interesting, insightful story in what it takes to be able to slowly but surely, people who can't even talk to their uncles at Thanksgiving need to kind of read these kinds of stories. We all do, actually. So this is just a glimpse in what's in these 12,000 stories. Like you can see, there's many ways to search it. There's more than 800 search terms, geography, news organization. And we are really interested in helping educators, helping parents, helping other journalists use this to map out and sort of create that internal map that we all need in our heads of what does the solution landscape look like in the world, because that's really what drives not just hope and a sense of possibility, but also creativity and the skills that people need to be 21st century powerful actors in the 21st century.
And the contagion around creativity, right? That, if you can see it, you can be it. This idea of, oh, these are amazing ideas that are surrounding me about issues that felt intractable prior. There are regular people doing amazing things. I think, and also for the educators who are on with us, these all are connected to the Sustainable Development Goals and SDGs in a way that really bring them to life. We think a lot about, in the US, does someone necessarily want to dive into an article about an international conflict that might address an SDG that's also very relevant in their own community? So this ability to search by geography is just incredible.
And something that students can do is they can actually look for patterns. They can look across 3 or 4 or 5 different ways that people are addressing a similar challenge, and look for what are the strategic principles, as you were saying, that are being used here. What's the leverage point that people are trying to deal with here? How are they getting the behavior change to happen? All of these really hard challenges, and you can really draw out these kind of teachable lessons from the ground level stories.
Yeah, it's incredible. One of the questions was actually the Christy, who's on with us, asked a question that was one of the ones I saved for last, which is, if folks who are in this room who are on World Savvy's mailing list are, I would say, they're predisposed to want to be change makers, to invest in this kind of hopeful, world-changing activity. And so the question that I had and that Christy says is, well, how do we drive this? How does this is a group of educators, funders, volunteers, folks who are parents. What does it look like for this movement to have the individual support of people like those who are in the room?
So I would say, in the spirit of everyone a change maker, this is, for example, if we just look at this platform, this is just a raw kind of wonky platform. It's very text heavy right now. It needs people to say, wait a minute, I'm going to turn this into a great educational tool. I can figure out an interface that might speak to, high school seniors, or might be right for social studies use, or what have you, however it fits into. We don't know curriculum that well. We have a few people who are, interfacing with education, but we don't really have education chops. We're kind of in the quick and dirty capture mechanism of innovation. That's kind of what this is about. Turning that into knowledge, turning that into educational tools, turning that into inspiration, amplifying that on social media, figuring out how to put this together. We're very happy to have other people tell us we're going to build something on top of this that's going to make it really useful for our school, or what have you, our nonprofit or our foundation. So I think that there's so much more that can be done. I mean, I think that we have frankly, we don't really know what to do with this resource. We are constant looking. I mean, we have a sense of what to do with it in terms of creating it, but really getting it into the hands of educators. It's really being used now in the journalism schools a lot. We have so many ways of showing people, this is what we mean by solutions journalism, and this is what we mean in an audio format, and this is what we mean in an audio format around health. And you can really, really get very granular at a certain point, for those are the kinds of questions that the educators need in order to train the new generation in that mode. But it's much more, it's useful broadly for, like, if you're going to have a course on climate change adaptation, or, you know,
Use these articles.
you want to be connected to the shop floor of the world, and that's what this does. It helps you make that connection.
Yeah. Now I really do want to talk about collaboration in that realm with World Savvy. We could have there could be a solutions journalism TikTok narrated by young people. I mean, why not? That are sharing solutions in their community and other places.
Yeah. I mean, if there's someone who has a TikTok platform, they could just, we'll send, if they say, I want a story a day about X, or I want a story a week about X, and I will turn that into a really cool video explainer that I'm going to send to my followers once a week, because I want them to be informed. We can totally help set that up and automate it, and help you be as effective as you want to be for the audience that you want to serve.
Incredible. And also a call to participate for everybody who's in the room. We've got just a couple of minutes left. And I see Kathy's talking about creating an international disability advocacy space through this, which would be really incredible. And then a fairly specific question for, I think coming from Zoe around, could graduate students who are learning to be solutionaries and humane educators, but work in a lot of fields that aren't education, work with solutions journalism to do a practicum or a capstone? Have you done that with your staff before to help kind of cross-pollinate other sectors?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Zoe works with the Institute for Humane Education that has a graduate program for folks that want to be solutionaries. That's their framing.
Okay,
and I think that they have to do practicum and capstones. And so, have you ever done that, or can they apply for a fellowship with you? Or I don't know what besides LEAD, which is the youth fellowship, are ways that you're trying to support other graduate programs?
Yeah, so
if I mess that up, Zoe, you can correct me.
Yeah. So the LEAD Fellowship is designed to support, just to explain what that is, people who are creating platforms in some way to advance the practice or understanding of solution journalism. So it's very specific. It's international. It's in 18 countries, fellows in 18 countries. But in terms of creating that practicum, that's exactly the sort of thing that we would invite people in the network to collaborate and create that. And they can own the practicum. We will give them all the tools they need to build that. And then that's their thing. It will sit on top of this, but it's totally their, put their name on it,
yep,
raise the funding around it, and sort of make it happen. We will continue to upgrade this resource, and it will get richer and richer because the network continues to grow. Our biggest problem now is keeping up with how quickly we can load stories into it, because
I imagine. Yeah.
So maybe if someone out there is we're talking about AI ideas now in terms of being able to make that happen. The resource will continue to there's also stuff in German and stuff in French and other languages, which is another degree of difficulty challenge as well.
Right.
But building if there's a lot of clients that want a kind of an app built on top of this that can justify, like a bunch of people come to us and say, would you build this for our network of schools or universities? Then we can talk about it, whether that's that, but we'd have to really see there's demand. We can't build things until we really know that there's going to be used,
Yeah. Well, and as you've shared, for those who joined us a little bit later, the growth of this movement, from wanting to grow solutions journalism is something that news networks were doing to now sort of transform the whole field has not only been quite successful, but really rapid. I mean, it is this conversation tonight to me gives me a lot of optimism, because I think for a lot of folks joining the last couple of years have felt doomsday in terms of our relationship with media and with news, and to know that this is out there as a really powerful tool is just incredible. So I want to just respect everyone's time tonight, that we are kind of at the end of when we were going to gather, and just so appreciate you, David, and the work that you've done, having been a super fan from the beginning. It's just, and as an educator, and what World Savvy is doing, the need for this is extraordinary. And I hope all of you who are joining us leave with a real tangible way to feel less depressed about the news, that you can hopefully use to make creativity contagious in your own circle. So please join me in thanking David tonight for your time. This recording will be available, and We will follow up to all the participants to also resend David's PBS video that we didn't get the full benefit of the visuals on. So a lot of appreciation for you in the chat tonight, David.
Oh.
And to you all for joining us for the second Changemaker series. We'll be back in November with an incredible group of young people called the Bridgemakers, who are trying to work on education reform and youth-led change here in Minnesota and everywhere. So thank you again, everyone, so much. We'll put up a slide if you want more information with contact info, and wish you all a wonderful night from Minneapolis out to wherever you are.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, David. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.